If someone had told me 10 years ago that the boy who made my life a living hell would one day be the man who saved it, I would have called them a liar. Not just a liar, but a cruel one. Back then, Mason Thorne was a storm cloud on the horizon of my high school existence, a constant threat of rain and thunder. He was broad-shouldered and loud, the king of a court I never even wanted to visit, and his favorite pastime seemed to be making my quiet, bookish life as small and uncomfortable as possible. My life now, my adult life, was built on the foundations of that quiet. It was a fortress of solitude, meticulously constructed with routines, soft lighting, and the silent company of 1,000 paper-bound worlds. I worked as a university archivist, a job that suited my temperament perfectly. I spent my days in the hushed, climate-controlled basement of the library, cataloging the lives of the dead. It was peaceful. It was predictable. It was safe. My apartment was an extension of that safety. A small, second-floor walk-up filled with overflowing bookshelves, a comfortable armchair worn into the perfect shape of my body, and a single coffee mug. It was a haven, a place where the chaotic noise of the outside world faded into a manageable hum. I liked my solitude. Or rather, I had convinced myself that I did. It was easier than admitting the truth that I was lonely, and that the loneliness was a cage of my own making, built from the fear that letting anyone in would only lead to the same pain I remembered from years ago. The memory of Mason was a cornerstone of that fear. He wasn't just a bully. He was the embodiment of a specific, searing humiliation that had defined my adolescence. He was a ghost I never expected to see again. In my mind, he remained forever 17, forever sneering in a crowded hallway, forever the source of a deep, aching knot in my stomach. The world was a big place. I had moved 2 states away for college and then stayed, deliberately severing ties with my hometown and the ghosts that haunted it. I had assumed he'd done the same, or at least that our orbits would never again intersect. But the universe, it seems, has a particularly ironic sense of humor. And on a Tuesday night in October, that humor came crashing through my living room window. The sound was like a gunshot, a violent shattering of glass and tranquility that ripped through the quiet fabric of my evening. My heart, a frantic bird, slammed against the cage of my ribs. I dropped the book I was reading, its pages splaying open on the floor like a broken wing. For a moment, I was frozen, trapped in the amber of pure, undiluted panic. My fortress had been breached. The world, loud and violent and unpredictable, had found a way in. I heard footsteps, heavy and clumsy, inside my own home. My breath hitched, caught in my throat. Every horror movie trope, every late-night news report, coalesced into a single, terrifying thought. I was no longer alone. I did what any sensible, non-confrontational archivist would do. I scrambled backward, crab-walking away from the living room, and locked myself in the bathroom. My hands shook so violently I could barely turn the deadbolt. I fumbled for my phone, my thumb slipping on the screen as I dialed 911. The voice on the other end was calm, a steady anchor in my sea of terror, but I could barely form the words. "Someone's in my apartment," I whispered, my voice a ragged, unfamiliar thing. They broke the window. I gave her my address, my words tumbling over each other in a desperate, breathless rush. She told me to stay on the line, to stay quiet, that officers were on their way. The minutes that followed were the longest of my life. I sat on the cold tile floor, my back pressed against the door, listening. I could hear the intruder moving around, the sound of drawers being pulled open, of my carefully curated life being ransacked. It was a violation so profound it felt physical, like fingers probing a raw wound. Each sound sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through me. My quiet sanctuary was being desecrated, and all I could do was hide in the dark, clutching a cheap bottle of toilet cleaner like a weapon, and pray. Then I heard new sounds. Shouting from outside. "Police! Show me your hands!" The shuffling inside my apartment stopped abruptly, followed by a frantic crash and the sound of the back door, the one leading to the fire escape, being thrown open. More shouting, the sound of running feet on metal, and then a different kind of sound. A heavy, authoritative knock on my front door. "Police department. Sir, are you in there? It's safe to come out." I stayed put, my heart still hammering. What if it was a trick? My mind, overstimulated and paranoid, ran through a dozen terrible scenarios. The dispatcher's voice in my ear was my only tether to reality. "Sir, the officers have secured the apartment. You can open the door for them." Slowly, my limbs stiff and uncooperative, I unlocked the bathroom door. I crept out, my eyes wide, taking in the scene of destruction. The broken window gaped like a wound, letting in the cold night air. My books were swept from their shelves, my papers scattered. It was a small-scale hurricane, a whirlwind of chaos in my meticulously ordered world. Two uniformed officers stood in my living room. One was young, his face still holding a hint of boyishness. The other was turned away from me, speaking into his radio. He was tall, with a broad, solid frame that seemed to take up all the available space in my small apartment. He radiated an aura of calm authority that was both intimidating and, in that moment, profoundly reassuring. When he turned around, the air left my lungs in a single, silent gasp. The world tilted on its axis. Time seemed to warp, to stretch and thin, until the 17-year-old boy and the 30-year-old man stood superimposed on one another. The same dark, intense eyes, the same square jaw, now covered in a day's worth of stubble, the same mouth that had once twisted into a sneer and now was set in a firm, professional line. It was Mason Thorne, my ghost, my storm cloud, and he was standing in the ruins of my sanctuary. He didn't seem to recognize me at first. His eyes, a deep, assessing blue, swept over me, cataloging my disheveled appearance, my bare feet, the tremor in my hands. He was all business. "Sir, are you harmed?" he asked, his voice deeper than I remembered, gravelly and low. It vibrated through the floorboards. I shook my head, unable to speak. The shock of the break-in was suddenly eclipsed by the shock of his presence. It was a 1-2 punch that left me reeling, speechless, and dizzy. His partner started asking me questions, taking a statement, but I could barely focus. My attention was snagged on Mason. He moved through my apartment with a practiced ease, his movements economical and precise. He was examining the point of entry, his big hands surprisingly gentle as he touched the shattered fragments of the window frame. I watched him, my mind a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. Fear, resentment, and something else, something I couldn't name, a strange, unwelcome flutter of something. It was the same feeling I'd had all those years ago, a feeling I had buried under layers of anger and hurt. He turned back to me, his gaze lingering this time. His brow furrowed slightly. A flicker of something, confusion, recognition, crossed his face. He took a step closer, and I instinctively took a step back. "Leo?" he said, his voice softer now, questioning. "Leo Sterling?" The sound of my name in his mouth was a jolt, a key turning in a lock I thought was rusted shut. I could only nod, my throat tight. A strange silence fell between us, thick and heavy. His partner looked back and forth between us, sensing a current he didn't understand. Mason's professional mask slipped, just for a second, and I saw something complex and unreadable in his eyes. "I'll be damned," he breathed, more to himself than to me. He cleared his throat, straightening up, the police officer persona snapping back into place. Right. We'll need to get forensics over here. Don't touch anything. He turned away, back to the window. But the air had changed. The past was no longer a ghost. It was here, in my living room, wearing a badge and a gun. The next hour was a blur of official activity. Crime scene technicians dusted for prints, their quiet efficiency a stark contrast to the violence that had preceded them. I sat on my kitchen stool, wrapped in a blanket someone had given me, answering questions in a monotone. But all my senses were attuned to Mason. I watched him from the corner of my eye, tracking his every move. He was different. The raw, aggressive energy of his youth had been tempered, forged into a kind of steady, confident presence. He was still physically imposing, a mountain of a man, but he moved with a purpose that was no longer about intimidation. It was about protection. The irony was a bitter pill. I found myself noticing things, small details that the chaos of the moment couldn't obscure. There was a thin white scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a detail that hadn't been there in high school. His hands, which I remembered balled into fists or shoving me against a locker, were now calloused and capable, documenting evidence with a steady, practiced hand. As he crouched to examine the floor, his uniform shirt stretched taut across his back, revealing the powerful muscles beneath. And I hated myself for noticing. I hated that after all these years, after all the pain, some broken part of me was still drawn to him, still saw him as more than just the monster from my memories. As the forensics team packed up, his partner came over to me. We've got a good footprint, and it looks like he cut himself on the way out. We'll find him, Mr. Sterling. I nodded, the words barely registering. My focus was on Mason, who was now approaching me, his expression serious. You have somewhere to go for the night? He asked. We can't release the scene yet, and you can't stay here with the window like that. I shook my head. No, I don't really know anyone here. The admission felt pathetic, laying bare the solitary truth of my existence. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze searching my face. I could feel the weight of his stare, and I had to look down at my hands, clasped tightly in my lap. There's a motel down the street, he said finally. I can give you a ride. I can walk, I said too quickly. The thought of being in a confined space with him, in the close intimacy of his patrol car, sent a fresh wave of panic through me. He seemed to understand, or maybe he just saw the fear in my eyes. Okay, he said, his voice neutral. My partner and I will be outside for a while, finishing the report. The area is secure. Just be careful. He handed me his card. Call this number if you think of anything else. It's my direct line at the precinct. His fingers brushed against mine as I took the card, a fleeting, accidental contact. It was nothing. It was everything. A jolt, like static electricity, shot up my arm. My breath caught. I snatched my hand back as if I'd been burned. His eyes met mine, and for a split second, I saw that same flicker again, that same unreadable emotion. Then it was gone, shuttered away behind a professional mask. He gave me a curt nod and turned to leave. As he walked out, I realized something else. Underneath the crisp, clean scent of his uniform, I had caught a faint whiff of something else. Coffee and weariness. I could see it in the slight slump of his shoulders, the faint shadows under his eyes. This wasn't the invincible titan of my high school nightmares. This was just a man, a tired man doing a difficult job. And that realization was, in its own way, more terrifying than anything else. It made him real. It made the past feel dangerously, frighteningly present. The motel room was sterile and impersonal, smelling of bleach and stale air. It was a world away from the familiar comfort of my apartment. I couldn't sleep. I lay on the stiff sheets, staring at the textured ceiling, my mind replaying the night's events in a relentless loop. The shattering glass, the fear, and Mason's face, his voice, the brief shocking warmth of his fingers against mine. It was a sensory overload that left me exhausted but wired, my thoughts racing in circles. The next day, I had to deal with the aftermath. The landlord, the insurance company, the window repairman. It was a litany of tedious, stressful tasks that I navigated in a fog of sleeplessness. By late afternoon, my apartment was secure again, a sheet of plywood temporarily covering the gaping hole where my window had been. The mess had been tidied, but the sense of violation lingered, a greasy film over everything. My sanctuary felt tainted. I was trying to reshelf my scattered books when there was a knock at the door. My entire body went rigid. My heart leaped into my throat. I stood frozen, listening. The knock came again, firmer this time. "Leo? It's Officer Thorne. Mason." My breath escaped in a shaky sigh. I wasn't sure if it was relief or a new kind of anxiety. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. He was there, out of uniform now, wearing a simple gray t-shirt and jeans. He looked younger, less intimidating, but somehow bigger, more solid, without the formal structure of his police gear. I hesitated for a long moment before unlatching the door. He stood on my welcome mat, his hands shoved in his pockets. He looked uncomfortable. "Hey," he said. "Sorry to bother you off duty. I was just checking in. See how you were doing." "I'm fine," I said, my voice tight. I kept my hand on the doorknob, my body half blocking the entrance. It was a clear, unspoken signal. You are not welcome here. He seemed to get it. He shifted his weight, looking down at his boots. "Look, I know this is weird, seeing me." He finally met my eyes, and his were filled with an earnestness that caught me off guard. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay. And to tell you, we caught the guy. He was a local kid, high on something, hit a few places in the neighborhood. We recovered some of your things." The news was good, but it felt secondary. A footnote to the larger, more complicated story that was standing on my doorstep. "Oh," I said. "That's good. Thank you." An awkward silence stretched between us. The air hummed with everything that was unsaid, a decade of history packed into a few feet of hallway. I should have closed the door. I should have said goodbye and retreated back into my fortress. But I didn't. Some perverse curiosity, some long-buried piece of my past, kept me rooted to the spot. "Can I?" he started, gesturing vaguely toward the inside of my apartment. "Just for a minute? I feel weird talking about this in the hall." Every instinct screamed no, but I heard myself say, "Okay." I stepped back, opening the door wider, and he walked in. My small apartment seemed to shrink around him. He stood in the middle of the living room, looking out at the boarded-up window, his presence a stark, masculine contrast to my quiet, book-filled space. "I'm sorry about all this, Leo," he said, his back still to me. "About your place. No one should have to go through that." "It's not your fault," I replied automatically. He turned around and his expression was pained. "No, but look, I also need to say I'm sorry for back then, for high school. I was a stupid kid, an idiot. There's no excuse for how I treated you." The apology hung in the air between us, a shocking, unexpected thing. I had spent years fantasizing about this moment, imagining all the cutting, witty things I would say if I ever had the chance. But now that it was here, I was empty. The anger I had nursed for so long felt thin and distant. Why? I asked, the single word carrying the weight of 1,000 questions. Why me? Why were you so cruel? Why are you here now? He ran a hand through his short-cropped hair, a gesture of profound weariness. I don't know. I was confused, angry. My old man was a piece of work, and I took it out on anyone who seemed different, easier. You were quiet, you were smart. It made you a target. He paused, his gaze dropping to the floor. And there was, that night, my blood ran cold. What night? I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. At Miller's party, after the homecoming game. His voice was low, almost a whisper. The dare. The memory flooded back, sharp and unwelcome. A crowded, sweaty basement. The smell of cheap beer and teenage desperation. A circle of jeering faces, Masons among them. Someone had dared him to kiss the quiet, nerdy kid in the corner. To kiss me. I remembered the heat of his hand on my neck, the rough scrape of his lips against mine. It wasn't a real kiss. It was an assault, a joke, a performance for his friends. It lasted only a second, but the humiliation had been branded onto my soul. The next day at school, the torment had escalated tenfold, as if he needed to scrub the memory of that moment away with a fresh wave of cruelty. I remember, I said, my voice flat and cold. I never forgot it, he said, and the intensity in his voice made me look up. He was staring at me, his blue eyes burning with something I couldn't decipher. I know it was a joke to everyone else, Leo, but it wasn't to me. It scared the hell out of me. My mind struggled to process his words. They didn't fit the narrative I had spent a decade building. In my story, I was the victim, and he was the heartless tormentor. But his confession introduced a new, complicated variable. His fear. You were scared? I asked, the words laced with a decade of disbelief. Terrified, he confirmed, his voice raw. I felt something I wasn't supposed to feel, and I didn't know what to do with it. So I got mean. I got cruel. It was easier to hate you than to figure out what was going on with me. He took a hesitant step closer. It was cowardly, and I've regretted it every day since. The room was silent. The only sound was the frantic drumming of my own heart. He had just taken the carefully constructed history of my pain and turned it inside out. He hadn't just been a bully. He had been a scared, confused kid, just like me. And the kiss, the single most humiliating moment of my life, had apparently been something more for him. A catalyst, a turning point. I didn't know what to say. The foundations of my fortress were cracking. The ghost I had feared for so long was standing in front of me, stripped of his monstrous form, revealing a vulnerability that mirrored my own. I saw the weariness in his eyes again, the deep-seated regret. The power dynamic, which had been so skewed for so long, suddenly felt level. He wasn't the confident king anymore. He was just a man, asking for a forgiveness I wasn't sure I had. Outside, the sky had opened up. A sudden downpour began to beat against the plywood covering my window, a frantic, drumming rhythm that matched the turmoil inside me. The storm had arrived, both literally and figuratively. Mason glanced toward the window, then back at me. I should go, he said, but he didn't move. It was as if we were both trapped, suspended in this moment of raw, painful honesty. The storm outside a fitting soundtrack to the wreckage of our past. Why did you become a cop? I asked, the question popping out of me, a desperate attempt to change the subject, to steer us back to safer ground. He seemed grateful for the shift. A small, sad smile touched his lips. I guess I spent a lot of my youth being the bad guy. I wanted to spend my adulthood trying to be one of the good ones, trying to fix things instead of breaking them. His eyes flicked around my ransacked apartment. Guess I'm not always successful. The rain was coming down harder now, a torrential, deafening roar. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging the apartment into a deep, disorienting twilight. I flinched, a small, involuntary gasp escaping my lips. The darkness felt sudden and complete, amplifying the tension in the room tenfold. "Hey, it's okay." Mason's voice came from the gloom, closer than I expected. I felt a warm, heavy hand on my arm, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. "Just a power outage. The storm." His touch was steadying, his grip firm but gentle. It wasn't the aggressive shove of a bully or the accidental brush of a stranger. It was something else entirely. It was deliberate, comforting, and it sent a cascade of confusing warmth through my veins. I could feel the heat radiating from him in the small, dark space. I could smell the faint scent of rain on his clothes. He was a solid, living presence next to me, and my carefully constructed walls were crumbling to dust. We stood there in the dark for a long time, him holding my arm, the only sound the relentless drumming of the rain. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was charged, filled with a new kind of electricity. "Leo," he said, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. He hadn't let go of my arm. If anything, his grip had tightened slightly. "Yeah?" I whispered, my own voice barely audible. "What I said before, about that night, I meant it. I've thought about it more times than I can count. I've imagined what would have happened if I hadn't been such a coward. If I'd just talked to you." My heart was a hummingbird, its wings beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This is happening. This is real. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. "What would you have said?" I asked, the words feeling impossibly brave. He was quiet for a moment. I could hear him take a breath. "I would have said that I didn't know what I was doing, but I knew I wanted to do it again. Properly this time. Without an audience." He let go of my arm, and for a second I felt a pang of loss. But then his hand moved, cupping my jaw, his thumb stroking softly against my cheek. The touch was feather-light, questioning. It wasn't a demand. It was an invitation. I could have pulled away. I should have. The rational part of my brain, the part that had spent a decade building defenses, was screaming at me to run. But I didn't. I leaned into his touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement. It was all the answer he needed. He moved slowly, giving me every opportunity to back away. In the dim light filtering in from the streetlights, I could just make out the dark shape of his face, his features softened by the shadows. He lowered his head, and his lips met mine. It was nothing like the first time. There was no jeering crowd, no violence, no humiliation. It was slow, hesitant, and breathtakingly gentle. It was a question, a confession, and an apology, all at once. It tasted of rain and regret and a decade of unspoken longing. I felt the tension drain out of me, replaced by a deep, shuddering release. My hands, which had been clenched at my sides, came up to rest on his chest, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart beneath my palms. The kiss deepened, becoming more confident, more sure. It was a conversation we should have had 10 years ago, a silent dialogue that spoke volumes. In the darkness of my broken apartment, surrounded by the chaos of the storm, something new and fragile and beautiful was being built from the ruins of our past. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his hands still framing my face. The power was still out. The rain still hammered against the plywood. But the world had shifted. The storm inside me had finally Stay, I heard myself whisper, the word a raw admission of a need I had long denied. Don't go back out in that. It was an excuse, and we both knew it. Okay, he whispered back, his voice thick with emotion. I'll stay. We didn't talk much after that. We didn't need to. He helped me find some candles, and we lit them, scattering them around the living room. The flickering light cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, creating an island of soft, golden warmth in the darkness. We sat on my sofa, not touching, but the space between us was no longer a chasm of hostility. It was a comfortable, humming silence, charged with the energy of what had just happened. I had let the storm in, and instead of destroying me, it had brought an unexpected calm. For the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel alone in my fortress, and I realized with a startling clarity that maybe it had been a prison all along. I woke to the pale, gray light of dawn filtering through my window. For a moment, I was disoriented, my mind struggling to catch up. I was in my own bed. The storm had passed. The apartment was quiet, and I was alone. My stomach plummeted. A cold, familiar dread washed over me, chilling me to the bone. He was gone. I sat up, my heart starting to pound with a sick, anxious rhythm. The sofa in the living room was empty, save for a neatly folded blanket. The candles were extinguished. There was no note. No sign he had ever been there, except for the lingering, faint scent of his cologne and the ghost of his lips on mine. It was a mistake. The thought slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. The darkness, the storm, the raw emotion of his confession. It was a fluke, a moment of weakness for both of us. He had woken up in the clear light of day, realized what he'd done, and fled. Just like he'd fled from that kiss 10 years ago, only this time he hadn't used cruelty to cover his tracks. He had used silence. The old shame came rushing back, hot and suffocating. I was a fool. I had let my guard down, allowed myself to believe that things could be different, and this was my punishment. The fortress I had so carefully constructed was now just a ruin, and I was exposed and vulnerable all over again. The solitude that had once felt like a comfort now felt like a life sentence. It wasn't just quiet anymore. It was empty. It was filled with the deafening absence of him. I spent the day in a miserable haze. I reshelved the last of my books, my movements robotic. I tried to read, but the words swam meaninglessly on the page. Every creak of the floorboards, every noise from the hallway, made my head snap up, my heart leaping with a stupid, pathetic hope that it was him returning to explain. But the door remained closed. The silence stretched from hours into a full day. Then, too, it was a physical weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. I saw his patrol car cruise slowly down my street once, and I practically threw myself to the floor, hiding behind the sofa like a frightened child, my heart hammering. I couldn't bear the thought of him seeing me, of the awkward, pitying look he might give me. The silence was better than that. The silence I could pretend was just busyness, a demanding job, anything other than what I truly believed it was. Rejection. I was reliving high school all over again. The brief moment of connection, followed by a brutal, isolating retreat. He had opened a door to a past I thought was sealed, only to slam it shut in my face once more. The pain was sharper this time, deeper. Because this time, I had let myself hope. The loneliness was no longer a dull, chronic ache. It was an acute, stabbing pain, a constant reminder of what I had briefly held and immediately lost. My fortress was rebuilt, brick by painful brick, but the walls felt thinner now, and the silence inside was unbearable. On the third night, I was sitting in my armchair, staring at the new glass in my window, when a knock came at the door. It was soft, hesitant, not the firm, confident knock of a police officer. My heart did its familiar, painful lurch. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just sat there, frozen, listening to the blood roar in my ears. "Leo?" His voice was low, muffled by the wood. "It's Mason. I know you're in there. Please, can we just talk?" I closed my eyes. Go away, I thought. Please just go away and leave me alone with the ghost of you. It's easier than the real thing. "Leo, I'm an idiot," he said, his voice strained. "I know how that morning must have looked. I am so sorry. I got a call. An officer down situation. I had to go. There was no time. And then I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to say. I panicked." His words were a crack in the new wall I had built around my heart, a tiny sliver of light piercing the darkness. I still didn't move. "I haven't stopped thinking about you," he continued, his voice closer now, as if he were resting his forehead against the door. "For the last 3 days. For the last 10 years, if I'm being honest. Please, don't shut me out again. I know I deserve it. But please, don't." The raw vulnerability in his voice was my undoing. It wasn't the voice of a bully or a ghost. It was the voice of a man who was just as scared as I was. Slowly, like an old man, I rose from my chair. My legs felt weak, unsteady. I walked to the door, and with a trembling hand, I turned the lock. He was standing there, looking exhausted. The shadows under his eyes were deeper than before. He was wearing the same gray t-shirt, now rumpled, and he was holding a sad-looking paper bag that smelled faintly of takeout. His expression was a mixture of desperation and relief. "Hi," he said softly. "Hi," I replied, my voice hoarse. We just stood there for a moment, staring at each other. The silence was thick, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with a fragile, tentative hope. "I was scared," I admitted, the words feeling like stones being pulled from my throat. I thought you regretted it." He shook his head, a pained look crossing his face. "No, never. I regretted leaving. I regretted not calling. I regretted being a coward again. But I didn't regret kissing you, Leo. Not for a second." He took a hesitant step inside, closing the door behind him. "This is all new to me. This feeling, being honest about it. It's terrifying. And I handled it badly. I'm sorry." The honesty in his eyes was disarming. He wasn't making excuses. He was just laying his own fear bare. And in his fear, I found a strange sort of courage. "Me too," I said. "It's terrifying for me too." A small, tremulous smile touched his lips. "So we're a couple of terrified idiots, then?" I felt the corner of my own mouth twitch upwards. "Seems that way." He held up the paper bag. "I brought food. I figured you might not have... I don't know, I just didn't want to show up empty-handed." It was such a simple, normal gesture, but it felt monumental. It was an offering of peace, an act of domesticity. "Come in," I said, really meaning it this time. I stepped back and let him into my life. We ate sitting on the floor. The takeout containers spread between us. We talked. Really talked. We filled in the gaps of the last 10 years, sharing the quiet stories of our separate lives. He told me about his difficult relationship with his father, his decision to join the force, the loneliness of a job that often felt isolating. I told him about my quiet life, my love of old books and silent rooms, the fortress I had built to keep the world at bay. It was a slow, careful unwrapping of two lives that had been unknowingly intertwined for years. When we were done eating, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his keys. He unhooked one and held it out to me. "What's this?" I asked. "It's a key to my place," he said, his expression serious. "I know it's fast. I know it's probably crazy. But I don't want there to be any more locked doors between us. I don't want you to ever have to wonder where I am or if I'm coming back." It was a tangible promise, a symbolic gesture that spoke louder than any apology. It was an act of profound trust, an offering of a future. I looked at the small piece of metal in his palm. It was more than a key. It was a choice to dismantle my fortress, to step out into the scary, unpredictable world, and to trust that this time I wouldn't be alone. I closed my fingers around it, the cool metal, a solid, reassuring weight in my hand. "Okay," I said. His shoulders slumped in relief, a long, slow breath escaping him. He reached out, his hand covering mine, his thumb stroking over my knuckles. "Okay," he repeated softly. "The mornings are different now. They are no longer silent. They are filled with the soft sounds of someone else breathing beside me, the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen, the comfortable weight of his arm draped over my waist. My single coffee mug now has a partner on the shelf, a big, sturdy ceramic one that feels too large for my hands, but fits his perfectly. Sometimes I wake up early, before him, and just watch him sleep. In the soft morning light, the hard lines of his face are relaxed, the weariness erased. The scar on his eyebrow is a faint silver slash. He looks peaceful. He looks like he's finally home. In these quiet moments, I trace the path of my life, from the terrified boy hiding in a school library to the man lying here, next to him. It's a journey I never could have predicted. Mason Thorne was the plot twist of my life. He was the storm that broke down my door and tore apart my carefully constructed world. He was the disruption, the chaos, the ghost from a past I wanted to forget. But he was also the one who stood with me in the ruins and helped me rebuild. Not a fortress this time, but a home. A place with 2 mugs, 2 toothbrushes, and a front door with a key he freely gave away. He taught me that the strongest walls are not the ones we build to keep others out, but the ones we learn to tear down for the right person. He was my bully, my savior, my ghost, and now he is simply my morning, my new beginning. And I wonder, have you ever had someone from your past reappear and completely change the course of your future? Let me know your story in the comments below. We all have our ghosts, and sometimes they come back to lead us into the light. Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing for more.